Recording. Okay, so there we are. Okay, and just a reminder, if you're not muted, to mute until we stop for questions. So what I want to do is I want to start with chapter 4 and specifically with verse 44. And then we will we'll move very quickly to pick up chapter 5. Yes.
I'm sorry, could you please give the page number?
Yes, sure. 1014.
Thank you.
Chapter 4, verse 44. Just a word about a word before we get to chapter 5. Zot HaTorah, this is the Torah that Moses set before the Israelites. And then, Elu ha'edot v'hokim ha'mishpatim, right? These are decrees, laws, rules that Moses addressed the people. So I want to talk just for a minute or so about the word Torah, because it's really a word that can mean a lot of different things. And in this context, it means a body of laws, right? This is the Torah, which is decrees, laws, and rules, right? The word Torah can also be used to just describe one law or one subject, right? This is the Torah of the leper. It says in Leviticus, someone who has this scaly skin disease, and it tells us about that. So it can be very specific. The Torah can refer to the first five books of the Bible. It uses that term once in Deuteronomy later on. And it's not really clear there whether it's the first 5 books themselves or whether it's just the book of Deuteronomy, right? But it does have that broader idea. Later Jewish tradition sometimes uses the word Torah to mean the entire Bible, right? Which is called the Torah Shebichtav, or the written Torah. And there, they're not just talking about the first 5 books, but they're also talking about the prophets, for example. Isaiah and Jeremiah are also in this sort of generic statement, this is the Torah, meaning here, and the translation here is a good one, teaching, right? The teaching of God to the people of Israel, either here or in fact through the prophets later on. And then we even get this idea, not just of the written Torah, but Torah Sheba'al Peh, which is the oral Torah, the oral traditions, those that we find actually recorded in the Talmud, for example. That too is Torah. And so sometimes when people will say, what do you do? Somebody might say, I study Torah. And what they mean by that could be anything. It could be that they're studying a particular passage from, let's say, the book of Exodus, with its commentaries. It could be that they're studying Talmud. It could even be that they're studying later compendiums of Jewish law, like the Shulchan Aruch, which is written centuries and centuries later, right? So the word Torah is a word that is hard to define. And here, the translation of teaching with a capital T seems to make sense. All right, we're going to move now to chapter 5. Vayikra Moshe el kol bnei Yisrael. Moses summons the people of Israel, and he says, Shema Yisrael. Hear Israel. We're familiar with the words Shema Yisrael as the beginning of the Shema, which we recite. We'll come to that in chapter 6, that actual Shema. But here, Shema means not just listen, not even just pay attention, but it has an implication of listen and act.
Thank you.
Hearken. In other words, that the words are causative. It's not passive listening, it's active listening, and it's active listening that leads to specific actions, or I would not just specific actions, but also the avoidance of specific actions, right? Because what we're going to look at here in the 10 commandments or 10 words is not just things that you can do or should do, but also things you should not do. Right? And in general, the commandments can be divided into two categories, right? The thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. Right? And there are more negative commandments than positive. And I think that is in itself interesting, because we often think that Jewish law is always telling us what to do, but actually it leaves a great deal of freedom. Yes, you shouldn't be stealing, but you can do all kinds of things. You just shouldn't steal. There are some positive things you should be doing, but life is largely unregulated. You can choose whatever profession you want. You can live whatever kind of life you want. You can have family, all kinds of things. And the tradition is not telling us the right way, the right things to choose, other than some things that you should do, and most importantly, things that you should not do. Okay, so Moses summons them and he tells them, and then he says, study these things and observe them faithfully. So now we're not going to get a lot of commandments here. We're going to get 10, though it's hard to divide them, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So it's interesting that it says study them, because, I could memorize them pretty quickly if I wanted to. I think most people could. So it's not about that, right? It's not about that. It is somehow engaging them, delving into them. And the other thing is so that you could imagine already a great deal of Jewish law that will stem from the study of these commandments, right? So we're going to see that we have a commandment to observe the Sabbath, right? And that's what it says, observe the Sabbath. But I'd have to study and think deeply and study what other people have said until I understand really what that commandment actually means. What things can I do? What things can I do? How, you wouldn't assume that when it says, observe the Sabbath, it's saying go to synagogue, make kiddush over wine, all of those things, right? So the idea here of study is really to dig deeply and profoundly into what is really very simple text. And that generates a great deal of, and I used the word before, Torah, not Torah in the sense of word by word, but Torah in the broader sense. This also leads us to another concept, which in Hebrew is called Torah Lishma, or Torah for its own sake. That is that in the Jewish tradition, there is a value to studying Torah. And that value transcends knowing what to do and what not to do. There's a rabbinic statement that you should study Torah because this is what you were created for. That is, the study of Torah is a holy act, and it's part of why we are here on earth. That's the rabbinic point of view. So it's not just a nice thing to do. It's not meant to be a hobby, right? It's in some sense profound, something that every Jew should be engaged in on an ongoing basis. And there are all kinds of stories about, for example, in the Shtetlach in Europe, in these small communities, people who weren't particularly learned would get together every morning for a brief study of the Book of Psalms or something else. That this is supposed to be simply part of your life in a regular and important way. So we don't actually generally, most people other than rabbis don't see it that way today, and I think that's a shame. One of the things that people have asked me, like lots of people have asked me actually, well, now you're retired, what do you do with your time? And my answer is I study Torah and do other things too. But this is finally, it's something I can really devote serious time to, which ironically enough, when I was working, I had so many other things to attend to. So, okay, Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. We're going to move on to verse 2 now. The Lord our God made a covenant with us at Horeb. Horeb is Mount Sinai. Moses is here, remember, in Moab, the plains of Moab, talking to the people who are about to enter the promised land. He's referring to this covenant which took place, 38 years earlier, a long, long time. And he says, God made a covenant with us. And the word covenant itself, brit, right, is a word, we think of it as like a brit milah, bris, right? But that's really the sign of the covenant. It's not the covenant. The covenant is a solemn treaty, promise that was entered into at Mount Sinai, somewhat like a marital bond, right? There's this idea that at Sinai we received the Torah became our ketubah in some sense, right? We were pledged to God, but then he goes on to say something striking. So he says, yes, God made a covenant with us at Horeb. It was not with our fathers that the Lord made this covenant, but with us, every one of us who is here today, the living. Right? So we have a sense here. It's a strong statement to say that God didn't make it with them, because clearly we have a sense that God did. But that covenant did not die with them. Right? Their descendants are as bound by that covenant as they were. Their descendants get all the benefits of the covenant and all the requirements of it. And the language here is really quite, I think, quite beautiful, right? It's not with our ancestors, but with us, we who are here today, all of us living, right? So it ends with that, we are alive, right? The covenant is not with the dead, right? There's nothing that the dead can do anymore. So they no longer are alive, but we are alive. And as long as we are alive, we are bound, as will our descendants be bound. The idea here is that the covenant is not really with individuals at all. It's a covenant with a people. And I think it's important to sort of think about that in a broader way. People often talk, and I think rightly so, they talk about their relationship with God. And particularly Christians, how's your relationship with God? Right? It's language, and also among Jews often, right? And the idea there is that everyone should have a personal relationship with God. But I have to say, from the point of view of the Torah, the relationship is much more with the people of Israel than it is with individuals in the people of Israel. to go a step further, we have a relationship with God through our membership in the people, and the people has an ongoing relationship with God. God is eternal. God will always be there. We say God was, God is, God will be, right? We are limited, right? We live and we die, and our lives are short. But somehow the relationship transcends us. We're links in a chain, it's going all the way back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. They began that relationship. They died, their descendants continued it, and so on, right through us. And when we have children, they get entered into that covenant. And by the way, whether they like it or not, because they're Jewish. Being Jewish is not something you can get out of once you're in. And profess another faith, but from the point of view of Jewish law, you're still Jewish. You might be a very bad Jew. You might be violating basic commandments, but it doesn't let you out. There is no conversion out. There is conversion in. And once you become a Jew, it's the same as every other Jew. You can't say, oh, I changed my mind. This isn't for me. Right? That's part of the reason why the conversion process is really a serious one. I was struck by the fact that when I was in college, I received a copy of the Christian Bible. The people were, these evangelists were going around on the college campuses, and you got this book, and in the back of the book, there was a little form, and it said, I accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. Sign here, right? And that's all you had to do. You were essentially a Christian. Now, you had to go learn what to do. You have to go to church and all of that. But you can become a Christian that easily. In Judaism, you're born into it, or you really have to go through a process of self-examination and learning, because once you're in, it's not a revolving door. Once you're in, you're in. So the covenant, not just made with our ancestors, but with every living descendant through time. I'm going to pause now and open it up for questions up to this point. Any questions? Yeah, Sandy, go ahead, and then Barry.
So Rabbi, you just said something that I was going to ask you. You said the Lord made not this covenant just with our fathers, but the text doesn't have that. Does the Hebrew imply that?
It does not. It could say that. It says God did not make this covenant. However, that seems, since it's very clear in the Bible that God did make that covenant, starting with Abraham. God makes a covenant with Abraham. It's extremely clear. We have a description of exactly how it happened and so on. It's just not a credible reading to say God didn't make a covenant with our ancestors. I would say it can only mean, and this is really, I think, remember, Moses is giving a speech, right? And it's quite, in some ways, quite poetic, and it's emphatic, right? So you can imagine him saying, don't think God made the covenant with your ancestors. God made it with you, right? Now, yes, God did, but Moses is trying to make a point, and that is, this is not something that happened, decades ago, right? This is something that is alive right now. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. Barry, did you have something you wanted to say or ask? If you do, unmute.
Yes, it's on a practical matter. There are questions as to who is part of the people and who is not. And there's certainly questions about what is the covenant. There's not certainly not general agreement. And
Yeah.
and
Good,
it's
so-
in fact, in Israel today, there's a lot of controversy over what constitutes the covenant.
Right. So, I mean, from the point of
And in
view.
fact, and beyond, even beyond that, who is part of the people?
Right. So the classic, so it's a complicated question.
Yeah.
And it changes over time. Because it's clear in biblical times that you could somehow become an Israelite. We see the example of Ruth, sort of classic example. She says, your people will be my people, and so on. And she seems to then become a Jew. In fact, she becomes the ancestor of King David, right? So, and by extension, then the Messiah, who is supposed to be a descendant of David. It seems, though, that in the Bible, the way you become Jewish if you don't convert is that your father is Jewish. It seems very clear that that is the case. Now, by the rabbinic period, and I don't know when this changes, it becomes the mother. Right? And so the accepted definition among Jews well into modernity was that if your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. If your father is Jewish, but your mother is not Jewish, you're not Jewish, right? That was the classic accepted role. The Reform movement decided to change that, in their view, probably because they were doing a lot of intermarriages and the two seemed to be connected in some way. And they said, no, a Jewish man who has a child, even if his wife isn't Jewish, that child is Jewish. I would point out that that is not precedented. In other words, throughout all Jewish history up to modern times, excuse me, it was one or the other. It was never both, right? But the Reform movement decided it should be both. And that does create some problems because now we have part of the Jewish community who is saying someone is a Jew, and part of the Jewish community who is saying, no, they're not Jews. And then when those people want to marry Jews, it's complicated. And of course, in Israel, then we also have the issue of what is a legitimate conversion into Judaism, right? And the definition of how you convert has also changed over time. Ruth did not seem to spend a lot of time studying or go to the mikveh, but she is accepted as a member of the Jewish people. We have, in the early rabbinic period, it seems Jews were interested in having converts. We have statements that teach them a few laws and get them in. That changes, perhaps because Jews are being persecuted and it becomes dangerous to make converts. And then it becomes much more of an involved process. And today, there are people who would say, well, if you're converted by a conservative rabbi, you're not really Jewish and all of that, right? So in both cases, historically, whether you're born a Jew, what that means, whether you're converted, what that means is, it's changed and maybe it will continue to change. However you determine what the people is, that people is bound, and that covenant exists with them today. Okay, so anything else before we get into the commandments themselves? Marilyn, go ahead. And then
Any place in the Torah where the covenants are listed
So the covenant is not, covenant is a relationship, right? And we have we're going to see that here. We have an exclusive relationship with God. We have bound ourselves to that. That gives God the right to tell us certain things. It gives us certain obligations, right? So in a sense, the whole Torah is, what the covenant is or what it means, but it's not really about, I agreed to do this. It's really about I entered into a relationship in which you have the right to tell me what to do, right? And whatever you tell me, I am bound to do. And we're going to see this in just a minute or two as we come into looking specifically at what are called the Ten Commandments. Somebody else had a question. Saul, go ahead. And you have to unmute.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention Zot B'riti. The first time I saw that was when God spoke to Noah after the flood.
Yes.
That's the first time.
Yes. So what we really have are a series of covenants, right? You could say there is a covenant with Noah, which is in a sense a covenant with all humanity. Then we have a covenant with Abraham, specific covenant. And then we get to the covenant on Sinai. The covenant with Abraham is with a particular family. The covenant on Sinai is with the people. And it's also worth noting, each of these covenants has a sign, right? The sign of the covenant with Noah is the rainbow, which is going to be, and it's called the oat. It's called this sign. And there the covenant really doesn't seem to obligate, at least on the surface, doesn't seem to obligate Noah and his descendants to do anything, although they'll be held accountable if they do evil. But it's basically God's making a promise. I won't flood the world again. When we get to Abraham, we have something that he has to do, and at least circumcision and more. He has to sort of follow God, walk in God's ways. And then we finally come to the covenant at Sinai, where we really have lots of obligations on our side. And it's not so clear. It doesn't really talk about God's obligation, except that God has taken us to be a special people. Okay. Sandy, last one, and I want to move on. Go ahead.
Rabbi, getting back to Noah, what the covenant with Noah weren't there the 7 laws of Noah?
Okay,
For all
so,
people?
right. So we have what are called the 7 Noahide laws, but they are not, it's not really mentioned in the Torah as such. This is the rabbis who are going to come and derive these sort of what is basic human decency, right? That's kind of what can be expected of every human being, right? And the Torah doesn't say that. And in fact, if you go and study the 7 Noahide laws, they're actually not even derived from the story of Noah. They are basically derived from God and Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It's those verses from which the rabbis deduce those laws. So I would say it's really separate from what's referred to as a covenant with all humanity as we get it in the story of Noah. Okay, let me change the view and let's dig in. Okay, so it is not with our fathers, with us, and God spoke to you face to face on the mountain out of the fire. So the language here of face to face, obviously God does not have a face, but the sense here is directly, right? God is talking to you directly, addressing you directly, but he says you were afraid and didn't go up to the mountains saying, because you were afraid, I stood between you and God, right? So Moses is here a kind of microphone. He is amplifying God's voice because the mountain is all on fire and no one really wants to go that close. And so Moses is here conveying God's words, and the assumption is he's conveying them faithfully. Now, the tradition picks up on this idea of the people's fear, and it actually asks, so what did they hear beyond Moses? And we have a couple of different traditions. One is that they only heard the first two commandments, and I'm going to show you where that tradition comes from in a minute. And the other, which I think is really quite something, is that they only heard the first letter of the first word. And if you look at the first word in verse 6, it's Anochi, I, and of course, the first letter, Aleph. And if you know any Hebrew, you know Aleph is silent. So that suggests that what the people actually hear is not something that's in words. And Jewish mystics, of course, have made a great deal out of that. It's simply worth noting. I don't think it's what the text says, but there is some basis for making a distinction between the first two commandments and what follows, and to think that the people are somehow getting the first two other than what follows. Let me show you that as we move into them. Okay, so now the question becomes, we know there are 10 of them. Where does the first one end and the second one begin? And it's really quite murky. So let's look at the first sentence. I am the Lord your God. I am, and I want to emphasize this, Adonai. I am Adonai. This is God's name. Hey, you know who's talking to you? It's Adonai. It's me, right? And what is our relationship? Why should you be listening to me? Because I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, the house of bondage. In other words, you owe me. We have a relationship. I did something for you, and when I did it, I acquired you as a people. So many scholars have, now that we have dug up archaeologically all kinds of treaties, ancient treaties, what are called suzerainty treaties. These are treaties between a king and a vassal king. They always start the same way. I am King so-and-so who did this for you. And therefore, you have to, I don't know, bring me tribute, pay taxes, serve in my army, do all kinds of things. And you can't, you're my vassal. You're not somebody else's vassal. If you join somebody else, it is, you're not being faithful to me. There'll be consequences for you, right? So the form here, not talking about the contents, but the form is actually that of an ancient treaty between a king and a vassal people, right? And back in the day when people received this, it's something they would have understood. Now, having said that, this is nothing like any treaty that we have from antiquity. And in fact, there are elements in it that are really unlike anything in any ancient law. And we'll come to that. I want to just, there is Menachem Mendel of Kutz, who was an early Hasidic rabbi, has a wonderful statement. You'll see it at the bottom of the page, in the bottom commentary. I am the Lord, right? And so it is, it's actually, I'm sorry, yeah, it's on verse 5, right? I stood, right? I stood between God and you. So look at what Menachem Mendel of Kotz says. This clause can also be read, I, that is your ego, right? The I stands between you and God. It's a very clever reading. And, you know, what Menachem Mendel of Kotz is suggesting is that our own ego can get in the way of our relationship with God. Clearly not what the text means at all, but it's a very clever kind of use of the text to make what is really a sermonic point. And I think a profound one, right? That we get in our way, that if we can become humble, it's easier to enter into a relationship with God. Okay, so the house of bondage, an expression which has become, it's sort of robbed of its, we say, oh, Egypt's the house of bondage. But the idea here is in other contexts, where we're talking about a slave barracks. The whole country of Egypt is like a slave barracks. And think about, I mean, the African American experience when they were in these in Africa, they were gathered together into these fortresses from which they were sold. Egypt was a place like that. And then it goes on, you shall have no other gods beside me. That's the next verse. So is the first commandment, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the house of bondage? Or is the first commandment, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the house of bondage? You shall have no gods before me. You shall have no gods before me. Is that the second commandment or is it the first? So if you think I am the Lord your God who took you out of the house of bondage is a commandment, then it's a commandment to believe in God. That God is ordering us to believe in God. Most Jewish sources have never seen it that way. And Judaism in general is much more about action than about belief. And I think that's important to say. People sometimes say, well, Judaism is a faith. And by that, they mean a belief system, right? That it's believing in God. But Judaism generally has not emphasized that. Yes, you have to acknowledge God. But it's not so much about believing, it's about being in a relationship which makes demands on you and which you are bound by. So in general, the way this is read is that the first commandment is, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Therefore, you will have no other gods beside me. Now, again, Deuteronomy does acknowledge that there are other divine beings, right? And we read that passage where we read, well, God sort of gave them to the other peoples. This isn't necessarily exclusively monotheistic. What it means is, for us, given what God did to us, for us, we have an exclusive obligation to God alone, and we may not have any other gods. Right? And what does that entail? That you shall not make a sculpted image, any likeness of what is in the heavens above, on the earth beneath, the waters below the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them. So this seems to be the second commandment. Not just that you can't have another God, but you can't make a physical representation you can't make it of our God, and you certainly can't make it of another God. And why not? Because you should not bow down to them or serve them. So I want to make it clear that for most of Jewish history, this has not been understood as a commandment not to make representational art. You could see these as two separate commandments, right? You shall not make these images of things in the heaven, on earth, below the sea. And you shouldn't bow down to them or serve them. And there have been brief times in Jewish history where that seems to have been understood that way. But it's certainly not what is generally understood. Representational art is fine, just don't depict God. And don't bow down to or serve another God, serve that image, even if it's an image of God. And I'll go back to the golden calf for a minute. You know, one interpretation of the story of the golden calf is that they were trying to represent God with that calf. Not that they were creating a pagan idol that they were going to serve. We're not allowed to we're not allowed to worship other gods, and we're not allowed to make representations of their gods or our God and to serve them. All right. And now we get this very difficult phrase. Because if you do that, there are consequences. For I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, right? El Kana, right? Impassioned is sometimes translated zealous or jealous, right? I will not look the other way. This makes me angry. I feel betrayed. But now all of this is suggesting that God has feelings. In the Bible, God has feelings. God is not some abstraction that we could say, and certainly Jewish philosophers have said, Maimonides, well, the Torah is talking in human language. God obviously doesn't have feelings. It just tried to make it clear to us that God is strongly opposed to this. But I don't read it that way. It seems to me that God, when God says, you know, I am impassioned, there's passion. I won't put up with this. Right? I'm not going to overlook it. And what are the consequences? And here we come to this very, very difficult phrase. I am an impassioned God. Oked avon avot al banim, who will visit the guilt of parents upon their children to the third and fourth generation of those who, it says those who reject me, but it's really those who hate me, right? But show chesed, kindness to those who love me through the 1,000th generation. Okay, so God punishes children for the sins of their parents is very difficult, right? I mean, we would reject that pretty much out of hand. It's not the way it, you know, to put it in strong terms, that's not a God I can believe in, right? I think many of us would say that, punishing innocents for the crime of the guilty. I want to say a few things about that. The first is that it is the corollary to something which we call zechut avot, which is the merit of the ancestors, right? Because of God's relationship with the patriarchs, we have a special relationship with God. God loves us because God loved our ancestors, right? That's the positive, right? The negative is if our ancestors were bad, not good for us. And so that's one way of looking at it. But frankly, it still seems unjust, right? It's true that we like to, we go to shul on Yom Kippur and we say, if not for our own sake, forgive us for the sake of our ancestors, right? We have a chip that we can pull in, right? Hey, look, right? But still, right? Now, to make things even more complex, I want to ask you to turn to page 1131, which is chapter 24, verse 16. Again, 1131, later in the book of Deuteronomy, which we will come to, God willing. But for now, look at the top of page 1131. Parents shall not be put to death for children, nor children to put to death for parents. A person should only be put to death for his own crime. That's pretty straightforward, right? So how do we square that with the idea that God will visit the guilt of the parents upon the children? Well, one way to square it is to say, God's allowed to do that, but we're not. Right? It's being directed to a court, right? It's talking about how Jewish justice should be pursued. You're not allowed to kill kids because of what their parents did. Still, it's difficult. In the prophets, later on, we will see prophets like Jeremiah who simply say, no, children are not in God's name. Right? Not talking about a human court, children are not to be punished for the sins of their parents. And you could see that as a kind of evolution. But I want to suggest something else, right? You can read it this way. Visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third or fourth generation of those children who reject me. That's a possible, plausible reading. In other words, the question of those who reject me, is it referring to everyone or is it referring to the third and fourth generations of the parents who have done evil, right? And I think that is a plausible reading here, and certainly one I'm most comfortable with. So what does it mean? What it means is, if your parents behaved badly and set a poor example for you, you can't say, well, I didn't know any better. Look at the way I was raised. You're not off the hook. Even if your parents were bad, even if your parents and your grandparents and your great-grandparents were bad, you're still accountable. This essentially, by the way, is the idea of bar and bat mitzvah, right? Up until you come of age, if you sin, it's your parents' fault, right? At a bar mitzvah, there's a tradition that parents say, blessed are you, God, who has absolved me of responsibility for the sins of this child. But when a kid is 14 or 15 or 25 or whatever it is, no, even if there was a bad example, no, right? I think about, mafia families and someone who, though it's hard, right, breaks away, refuses to be part of it. So I think that is at least one plausible reading of this. I would say it is, at least to my mind, the most acceptable. We've actually now looked at two commandments. Right? The first one is that we should have no other gods before us. And then the second one is that you can't create these images, bow down to them and serve them. And then we have this statement of the consequences, probably for both of the first two commandments. We're going to go on to the third one, I suspect, next time. So as I said earlier, we're really making very slow progress, but I think it's important. I'm going to open things up and invite your questions at this point. Go ahead, Myra. And everybody can unmute at this point.
Okay, when did the commandments look like they do with the big what's called stones? I mean, you know, it doesn't look like that in this.
When you say big stones, I'm not quite.
I mean, like you see above the altar, you know, with one side is one and one side is the other.
Oh, okay, yes, okay, you're talking about the tablets. right?
Tablets, thank
That
you,
we-
yes.
That we would see in the synagogue, perhaps over the ark.
Right, yes,
So there's a description of Moses coming down from the mountain when the people are dancing with the golden calf. And it says he has two tablets in his hand and he throws them down and smashes them. Right, and he's just been on Mount Sinai and he's just received a different version, slightly different. We're going to talk about those differences next time of this. So that's where the idea comes from. It becomes decorative art in synagogues. And in general, we see, one side having the first part of it and the other tablet having the second part of it.
yeah,
There
that's
are-
what, it doesn't read like that here, and
It doesn't, right, it does
and
not.
it's shortened too, isn't it? The commandments,
Yes, so when you see them on the ark, over the ark, generally you see just the first word. Right, or the first word or two, right? But presumably what Moses brings down from Mount Sinai, right, is the commandments in total, all the words. It just doesn't work as decorative art. And it's just a decoration, right? There's no requirement that you have this in synagogues at all. Sometimes arks have lions on them, right? There are all kinds of symbols that you can see, and there's no sense in which these tablets were somehow decorating the tabernacle, which was the tablets were in the tabernacle, that's something else. But so this becomes an artistic convention.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, it was common to have the temple menorah as a decoration. We often have that in synagogues today, 7-branched menorah. They used to have lulav and etrog. Pictures of a lulav and an etrog as kind of a synagogue decoration. So there are all kinds of things. Okay, other questions? Go ahead, Sandy, and then Barry. Anybody else? Go ahead, Sandy.
So Rabbi, you made me aware of a lecture talk where this was discussed what about the punishment, about the
Yes.
children being punished for the sins of their fathers. And in this talk, it was brought up that it's not really punishment, but logical consequences. For example, if we don't take care of the environment, then the sin of not doing that will go to the children and the grandchildren, et
Yes.
cetera.
Sure. I think that's a beautiful idea. I'm not sure that that's what the Torah intends. I think the more the consequences are, if we behave badly, they'll behave badly, and we're not going to let them off the hook just because they got a bad example. I love the idea of the environment, but this is really talking specifically about this covenant, and environmentalism is part of the Torah. We'll see it. It's actually in the book of Deuteronomy quite specifically, but I don't think here. Good. I saw at least one. Barry, go ahead.
Is there any sense of what the punishment would be?
Sure. Yeah, if it's
If
idolatry,
for instance, if we worship an idol,
yeah, well, if it's idolatry, the punishment is death. From the point of view of the Torah, God does not, this is a deep betrayal, right? Now, I mean,
but then,
that is
but-
that
but
world.
how-
But remember.
How is that
remember-
punishment passed on to the children?
Right, so there again, it's hard to believe that what this is requiring is, that we're gonna put together, not only kill somebody, but their kids and their grandchildren, right? You do have a little bit of that maybe in the story of Korach, whose sons disappear with him. But it's not really clear there. So I want to leave this here. We are out of time. I want to, we'll pick up with what is the third commandment next time. I hope to finish the 10 commandments next time. Then we're going to be taking 2 weeks off when I'll be in Florida, though kind of on the opposite coast from you. And when I'll be back, then we'll go in sequence. I did mention last time that though I have some ambivalence about it, I'm going to suggest that if you want to, not required in any sense, I'm delighted to have you in the class, but if you want to contribute something to offset some of my costs in terms of Zoom and just to compensate me for my time, since I am not employed by a synagogue anymore, I would be grateful for it, but I'm not checking. I'm not expecting, because the last thing I would want is for someone to leave the class because they can't or don't want to pay for it. I'm going to send out an email, the next one, in which I'll be giving you the details. We have 14 classes. I was thinking $75. It can be more, it can be less, but whatever you want, or not at all. So I'm going to send out an email, and there are a variety of ways should you decide to do this, and I'll list them for you. There are these things, Zelle and others, ways of transferring money. I'll give you the details for that, or I'll give you my address. You can just send me a check or do anything, and that's fine too. Okay, so again, look for that email, which will also have a link to next week's class, and I will look forward to seeing you then. All right, and Sandy, please hang around for a minute or two after class.
Thank you.
Okay, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Shavua
Thank
Tov.
you. Thank you.
My pleasure, literally my pleasure. Okay, as people slowly disappear, give this another couple of minutes, Sandy, and we'll be ready to go. Phyllis, if you want to stick around, it's okay with me, as you like. Okay, so Sandy, you asked me about the story of the Akedah, and whether Abraham passes the test or not, and what the nature of the test is. And I said, I'll give you my take on it. So this is my take. And it really is informed also by reading the story which precedes it, which is the story of Hagar. There's a lot of similarity between Hagar and Ishmael and the story of Abraham. So let me just remind you of that first. Right. So Abraham reluctantly sends Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. She doesn't have water, not much food. She thinks he's going to die. And then an angel comes to her and reassures her. And she raises her eyes and she sees actually that there's a well of water there. And they all survive, and he goes on and becomes the founder of a great people. So we have a mother who travels with a child whose life is endangered. She lifts her eyes, an angel comes, she lifts her eyes, and there's salvation. Okay, now to the story of Abraham. So God tells Abraham to go and to sacrifice his son. Now, I have to say, first of all, that by the standards of modern times, it's outrageous and abhorrent, and it's hard to believe in a God who would do that. In Abraham's day, I don't know. Actually, people did sacrifice their children. It may be that he was not, the sacrifice itself is less of a problem, actually, by contemporary standards, than the fact that it violates everything that God told him. Because remember that again and again, Abraham has no kids. And he says to God, look, I have no children. Let my servant be my heir, right? Eliezer. And God said, no, it'll be your own children. And then Ishmael is born. And he wants to make Ishmael his heir. God says, no, through Sarah. Sarah, the son born of Sarah, Isaac, is the one who is going to continue. And now we have God saying, slaughter him. How is that even possible? In other words, it's not just the outrage over demanding human sacrifice, which we'll see God rejects, but it's more than that. It contradicts everything that God has told Abraham about Israel. So they go 3 days, walk in the wilderness. Isaac begins to wonder what's going on. He says, well, I see you've got the wood and everything, but where's the animal? Abraham says, God will provide. And we're wondering, what does he mean? And because it's supposed to be Isaac, but okay. So he gets there. He binds Isaac on the altar. He is ready to do it. The angel comes and he says, no. I see that you're faithful. It's not what God wants. God doesn't want this sacrifice. And then it says, Abraham lifts his eyes, just like in the story of Hagar. He sees the ram. He sacrifices the ram. And then the angel says, oh, good. And the covenant will continue with you. Right? So you have to wonder, well, why does the angel speak twice? What's the deal with the ram? So I want to say this. The ram, I think, was there all along, right? He didn't suddenly come. He's got his horns tangled. He's caught. Remember what Abraham said, God will provide. God did provide. The problem is that Abraham is so focused and beside himself, just as Hagar was,
Mhm.
he doesn't see it. What God intends, I think, is for Abraham to make an extremely important leap. And that is, sacrifice can be symbolic, right? It's not that God wants your children. You can put something in place of that, and God has left it there for you. Right? Now, Abraham, I believe, gets it, right? Because no one tells him to sacrifice the ram. The angel doesn't say, hey, Abraham, go sacrifice the ram instead. Just says, no, not the son. And Abraham makes that connection. Right? And then the angel says, Yesher koach, you got it right. The covenant will continue for you. So I think the test really is the test of somehow squaring God's commandment to make the sacrifice with God's promise that it will continue through Isaac. And Abraham almost fails. And then he gets stopped. And then he sees the ram. And then he does what God intended him to do. So that's my read. All right.
That's actually a very lovely reading because, with what you said with Hagar and the connection there, I'd never seen that before. Thank you.
There's a lot of similarities in the language. If you, not the least of which is he lifted his eyes, she lifted her eyes. Like one story follows the other. Abraham has two sons. Each story is about the survival of one of those sons to become the next link in the chain of a nation.
Mhm.
There's a tremendous amount of similarity between them, and I think it's completely correct to read one in light, and they follow each other in sequence. Right? You have, and we read them on the first day and the second day of Rosh Hashanah, right? The first day, we read about Hagar's story. And then we have a little passage in which Abraham makes a treaty with Avimelech. So it seems like everything is set up, everything is good. And then we get this in the second day of Rosh Hashanah, the continuation of the reading, which is the command to sacrifice.
Rabbi, just one second, if you just one sec. All right, no. Dina is just moved into her new apartment and she called me, but she said she'll call me back.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so she's in Boston, Cambridge, Massachusetts right now.
Right. You said
My
she was going to be in
call
Cambridge. So,
Yeah, thank you. I guess, I mean, I understand what you're saying. You should write that up somewhere so other people can enjoy it. I guess, going against the moral code at the very beginning just bothers me that Abraham just didn't say no. I'm not going to do this.
yes,
But
well, I think Abraham doesn't say no because that's the kind of stuff that God asks people to do in his world.
But am I right that people sacrifice children for a reason, or they just did it? In other words, they wanted something good to happen to them? I have no idea.
So it's really not clear whether, I mean, yeah, paganism is often viewed as a kind of quid pro quo, right? I give God something, God gives me something. But it could just be an expression of love, right? Or God demands absolute loyalty, meaning, whatever I tell you to do, you have to do. But I don't think, given the society, the question is, why doesn't Abraham say no? Why doesn't Abraham even argue?
Right.
Because he does argue for Sodom and Gomorrah,
Right.
right? But there in Sodom and Gomorrah, God's given him a reason, and he has an opening to argue. God says, well, they're terrible people. And then Abraham says, well, if you're punishing them, how can you punish the righteous along with the guilty? And they go and they negotiate, all of that, right? Here, God is not saying Isaac deserves this, where Abraham has the opening to say, oh, well, actually, he did this, he did this. God is simply saying, this is what I command you to do. So I don't think it's surprising, actually, that he would think that God could demand. Now, the end of the story is making it really clear that God does not demand such things, right? This is a story about how Jews don't, and it would be wrong for Jews to sacrifice their children, right? That's one of the things we take away from this. But I think the piece, and then I really have to go, I think the piece, this idea of symbolic substitution, is a kind of an imaginative leap that Abraham is expected to make, becomes very important in Judaism. Remember, when the temple is destroyed and animal sacrifices are now not possible, what do? They say, well, we'll read about it. We'll go to synagogue. We will read the section of the Torah which describes the sacrifice, and it'll be as though we offered it.
Right.
So it's a process, really, that I believe begins with Abraham and then is able to continue, and it becomes a kind of precedent for what we see later. Okay, I really got to go. I'm
Thank
really
you very
happy
much.
that
Thank you, Rabbi.
asked,
Thank
and I'll see you hopefully next week.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Always
Okay.
teaching it.
Right.